Welcome to tonight's Farm Advisory Service webinar. This is the second of our Sustainable Beef Systems Finishing Strong series, focusing on health in finishing cattle. So just a recap of where we are with Series 3 Finishing Strong so far. Our case study is online and ready to read, which you can find on the Farm Advisory Service Sustainable Beef Systems webpage. Our recording of our first webinar on nutrition is now available on the YouTube channel, and in that webinar we heard about the importance of monitoring growth rates to ensure our finishing cattle receive the correct ration to finish within the system timeframe. And to be successful in this goal, we also need to have healthy cattle. So health and nutrition are intrinsically linked, as good nutrition provides us with the building blocks for strong immune systems. But if we get nutrition wrong, we can also cause health problems such as ruminal acidosis. And we know that healthy cattle are more efficient and profitable. So over the next hour, we'll look at some of the common health conditions seen in finishing cattle, but obviously we don't have time to cover them all, so please use the questions for anything that we don't cover. We'll also review how dynamic health planning can streamline the performance of your finishing herd and should leave with some practical strategies to maximise health in your finishing herds. So we're joined tonight by two excellent speakers. First, we have Helen Carty, who is a veterinary investigation officer and centre manager of the AIR Surveillance Hub. Helen spends quite a lot of her time investigating cases where health has gone wrong, so she's ideally placed to guide us tonight. And also joining us to give the farmer's perspective is Aberdeenshire finisher Noel Gall. Some of you may recognise Noel from hosting BeefTech earlier this year, but he finishes around 1,000 head of cattle each year, buying them in on a weekly basis from up and down the country, alongside progeny from his suckler herd.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the kind introduction, and thanks for coming along this evening. Those poll answers, it's really helpful for me just to set the scene as to who we've got in the room, because obviously it's quite a different setup to the setup that Noel is operating, if many of you are breeder finishers. And I guess that means that there's a lot more that is within your control if that's the case. So what I've been asked to think about this evening is just to give you a bit of an overview of health planning, really, for finishing systems, and think about where you can make a difference, and think about what problems might arise for you so that you can get ahead of those problems and think about what mitigations you can put in place. So health planning is not a novel concept, but the idea behind it is very much that it should be a dynamic process, that you and your advisors, your team, are actively thinking about it, actively involved with it on a regular basis. Unfortunately, for some of us, it becomes a kind of tick box exercise, a form that needs to be filled in one year. But if that's the case, you're really not getting the most out of it, because if health planning is done well, then it's a really effective way of minimising problems and improving profit on your farm. So I guess if you're thinking about health planning, what I'd urge you to do first of all is to consider who's your team, who should be involved in this process. I guess any workers that you've got would have valuable insight into what's going on farm, and so they would definitely be worth including. Hopefully your vet would be a trusted advisor that you would want to bring into that conversation as well. If you're working with a nutritionist, they would have very valuable insights into what you could be achieving. And maybe any other consultants, could be part of that team as well. And it's important to set time aside to do this process, because if it's done as an on the hoof while you're doing another job, it won't be as comprehensive as it could be. And so for each system, you really need to think about what your targets are, and what targets you're going to have is going to be individual to your unit, isn't it? It's not going to be the same targets as your neighbours. So if you've got a very intensive finishing system, then your growth rate targets will be much higher, I would imagine, than perhaps a neighbouring farm that are employing a much more extensive system. Could your targets include reducing mortality? If that's the case, what were your mortality figures like last year? What would be an achievable target for you? It might be that for you working with your vet this year, you might consider that reducing antibiotic usage right down might be a really valuable target for you to work towards, or reducing your anthelmintic usage. So just think through what you're trying to achieve for your system this year, and discuss that with your team. When you've thought about what your targets are, I guess the next thing to think about is, what is it that might stop you from reaching those targets? So it's a case of thinking about what the risks to you achieving those targets are. And different people in your team will have different perspectives on that. I would imagine your vet would very much have the health risk challenges that could arise, and really that's what I'll go on to more as we go through the slides. For me, a big risk would be that you've got a big outbreak of pneumonia. We'll probably spend a bit of time talking about pneumonia. So if a big outbreak of pneumonia happened, why would that stop you achieving your targets? How could you minimise the effects of that pneumonia outbreak, or indeed prevent that pneumonia outbreak altogether? But the things that could stop you from reaching these targets might not just be related to health issues, to health risks. It could be somebody breaks their leg, the mixer wagon breaks, perhaps a treatment that you've used, say to treat for fluke, perhaps that's ineffective if the product used was stored incorrectly, or it had gone out of date. So a health planning meeting is a good opportunity to think of what the best possible outcome for your year is, and what barriers could arise that would stop you from getting there. And if you can think through what might go wrong, then you can think through what you can do to stop these things go wrong. Once you've thought through what your targets are, then how will you know if you've reached those targets? It's really important for you to think, how are you going to monitor your progress in that production season? So are you weighing? Are you recording medicine usage? Are you doing maybe fecal sampling to check if parasite products have been effective, for example? So what is your monitoring strategy going to be? And then at the end of your production cycle, if that's when you're selling all your fats, all your stores as fat, then if you've not reached the targets that you'd originally set, if the targets that the team set have not been reached, well, why didn't that happen? And don't beat yourself up over it, but are there things that you can learn from that? If there were 2 sudden deaths, did you get them investigated to understand why those sudden deaths occurred? And so that you can learn what prevention processes you could put in the following year to stop that from happening again. Failure will happen. We won't always reach the targets that we want to, but if you don't, then what lessons can we take forward from that? So I hope that sets the scene as to the sorts of conversations that we would expect that you would have when you're having a health planning session with your advisor. And I'd be really interested to hear from Noel later if that's the sort of way that the discussions with his vet go and with his advisors go when he's having a health planning session. So Laura alluded that I work in the postmortem room, so I see people's disasters on a daily basis. And clearly we can't cover everything, but I thought it might be useful just to pick sort of 4 topics that we can just go through one by one as to common reasons that finishing herds might not achieve the targets that they set themselves. So I'd like us to think about BVD in this session tonight. I'd also like us to think about BRD, so bovine respiratory disease, and a little bit about parasites and a little bit about Clostridial disease, but we'll probably focus on the first 2 for most of the time. So BVD is a favourite topic of mine. I sit on the BVD advisory group for the Scottish Eradication Scheme. I'm also involved in reporting on Premium Cattle Health Scheme herds. So I'm involved in sort of troubleshooting both aspects of it: high health scheme herds and herds where there's a mixture of disease status going on. It's about 15 years that we've been working on BVD eradication in Scotland, so we have been at it a long time. But before the eradication process started, there was evidence that about 40% of herds in Scotland had exposure to BVD. And the really good news story is that that's come down dramatically. So hopefully you can see these maps as I'm putting them up. These are heat maps, so the deeper the colour, that's the higher percentage of herds in those regions that have evidence of exposure to BVD. So back in 2013, you can see Southwest, where I work, is a hot spot for BVD. A lot of evidence of exposure to BVD then. I've taken out, we've got sort of yearly maps, but I've just picked out some of them just to give you the impression that as the years have progressed and as breeding herds have had to test for BVD, the number of herds with evidence of exposure to BVD is dropping dramatically. So the black areas where there's over 35% of herds with exposure to BVD have been eliminated, and the country as a whole is a lighter colour, meaning there's the prevalence of BVD has decreased. I got this slide just from Scottish Government, just from a recent meeting I was at. So phase 5 of the BVD programme kicked in at the end of December 2019, and at that stage, in terms of breeding herds, just over 12% of breeding herds still had evidence of exposure to BVD. And in the years since then, that has fallen. So we've now got less than 8% of breeding herds have got a not negative status for BVD. But that's still, almost 600 breeding herds where there could be BVD still circulating. So the reason I'm saying this is because I think a lot of people are becoming complacent about BVD because we've been at this eradication process for a long time. Surely we're done. And unfortunately, we're not. I'm very conscious that a lot of new vets have never seen mucosal disease, but it could still be responsible for a lot of disease outbreaks in herds in Scotland today. I had a look on Scotty ID, and this is figures just from a couple of days ago. So far in the eradication scheme, we've identified over 7,200 virus-positive animals, and these have been removed from the national herd. So that's a really good news story. When I looked, there were only 18 known live virus-positive animals on 8 holdings. So these are holdings that have got breeding herds on them. And on Scotty ID, if a breeding herd is retaining a virus-positive animal for more than 40 days, then that holding number is listed. So there was only one breeding holding that was retaining a virus-positive animal, and chances are, in a day or two's time, that animal will have been removed. People are really doing the responsible thing. But I guess I just wanted to point out to you that in Scotland, we've got about 7,500 breeding herds, but we've got almost 2,500 non-breeding herds. And non-breeding herds have much less requirements on them as far as the BVD scheme goes. But on Scotty ID, we can see how many animals of unknown BVD status there are. And so on Scotty ID, there's over 15,000 animals that we don't know if they're from a BVD negative herd. So they're either from a BVD not negative herd, or they've been brought in perhaps from south of the border. And so over 13,000 of these animals of unknown BVD status are on non-breeding holdings. So obviously not all of these will have virus there, but there's a potential that some of these are virus positive. And if some of these animals are on your non-breeding holdings and are circulating BVD within your finishing units, then that'll be really suppressing the immune system of your fattening animals, reducing growth rates dramatically, increasing disease, whether that's scour or pneumonia. So although there's not a strict requirement for you to know the individual BVD status, there's lots of good reasons for the health of your herd that you make sure you're not bringing in BVD for the good of your herd, and if you've got neighbouring herds, then it'll protect them as well. So just to remind you, the only obligations on non-breeding herds are if you have an accidental or a miracle birth, then that calf needs to be tested for BVD virus within 40 days of birth or before leaving the holding. But now, if a virus-positive animal is identified in a non-breeding holding, that'll be under the same obligations as a breeding herd will have. So that'll have to be housed, and they will be listed on Scotty ID if that animal's not removed. They can be removed direct to slaughter. It's not an offence to do that. But if that animal is in your herd, it's really risky, and it's causing problems in other animals that it's in contact with. So it's one to speak about with your vet, that even if there's not obligations for you to tissue tag, can you think about where you're sourcing animals from? If you go on Scotty ID and they have a not negative status, or if you're buying from south of the border, can you request knowing what they're, finding out what their BVD status is before buying? Or can you insist that you'll only take virus negative animals onto your holding just to cut out BVD as being a problem? So we can come back if there's any questions on that later. Okay, so following on from BVD, we've got BRD, so bovine respiratory disease. Clearly, this time of year, as we approach Christmas, the outbreaks of pneumonia are really commonplace, and they're definitely going to impact your growth rates and might lead to mortality in serious cases as well. Increased antibiotic usage. So yeah, it's a bad news situation all round if you get outbreaks of bovine respiratory disease. So it's not unusual, obviously, with BRD for us to see nasal discharge, perhaps see reddening of the eyes. Even though cattle are housed now in many parts of the country, we're still seeing issues with lungworm. So perhaps untreated lungworm when cattle came into house, it's only beginning to show clinical signs now when we've got cases of maybe secondary bacterial infection on top of an undiagnosed lungworm burden. So what causes respiratory disease? I've got a health warning for anybody who's squeamish. You might want to not look at these pictures, but I thought I'd just show some pictures from the post-mortem room just to give you a flavour of when you see an animal that's got, that's been coughing and you treat it for a few days and then it dies. Well, why does it die? Well, it dies because it cannot breathe, The lungs should be pink and spongy and air-filled. And when you get a pneumonia, the lung tissue goes from being this nice pink spongy tissue. I don't know, can you see my pointer, Laura? Yeah, so to the left of the picture here, this is relatively healthy lung tissue, but clearly at the front of the lungs here, this would have been where the head of the animal was. That lung tissue is dark, it's solid. If you were to cut off a bit of this lung tissue and throw it in a bucket, it would sink because there's no air in that at all. So clearly lungs that are like that cannot do their job. This type of picture is quite typical of a bacterial infection, maybe like a Pasteurella bacteria. But even though I've been doing postmortem for 20 years, even just looking at that, it's not possible for me to know for sure what has caused that, and further testing would be necessary to understand what the best treatment would be for the cohort of calves that one would be mixing with, or indeed how to prevent it. This is a pretty gruesome picture, this one, but this is showing a trachea, a windpipe, and that's my hands. I've cut down the length of the windpipe and I've opened up the windpipe. So I'm opening sort of this area here. Now the windpipe should just be a nice, smooth airway, shouldn't it? There should be easy flow of air in and out of the trachea, but there's a certain virus that can really cause a lot of damage to the tracheal lining, to the cells of the tracheal lining, so much so that the lining can slough. And that sloughed material can end up being inhaled, can lodge in the lungs, and then you can get secondary bacterial infection. So this is really typical of IBR. Saying that, you can sometimes get a mycoplasma causing a tracheitis or a Histophilus causing a tracheitis. So you would still want diagnostic testing done to confirm that. But IBR is not going to be on all herds. But if you're buying in from multiple sources, chances are you could well bring in animals with IBR, and animals that are naive to it could succumb to it to be as serious as that you end up with fatalities. I mentioned lungworm earlier, so if we're doing a post-mortem examination, we always cut right down the airways, deep into the bronchi and the bronchioles, and that's where we would find lungworms. So although I showed a picture of some lungworms just coming out the nostrils, they don't always crawl out to meet you. But a post-mortem examination is a really effective way of finding if lungworm are there. But just remember, even in house cattle, you might have lungworm if that burden wasn't cleared at housing time. A lot of the bugs that cause pneumonia are breathed in, aren't they? That there may be other cattle are a source of that bacteria or viruses, and they are inhaled. But sometimes you can get respiratory disease if there is infection circulating in the blood. So this is a set of lungs that were from multiple calves that had problems, but they had bad feet. They'd been scrambling about on a really rough surface, and that allowed infection to get in through their feet into the bloodstream and settle out in the lungs. So, that it wasn't obvious to the farmer who submitted this carcass that the problem was actually a lameness problem and a foot problem. He just saw it as a problem with breathing. And then doing the examination, looking at the distribution of the lesions, examining the rest of the carcass, let us understand where that source of the infection was. So that was a slightly unusual one, but it's a benefit of an investigation. Sometimes we'll get these horrible bully. So this is almost like bubble wrap, and this is really typical of like an acute viral pneumonia. So likes of RSV would cause a pneumonia like that, and animals can die really suddenly with an acute interstitial pneumonia. So I hope that just gives you the feel for pneumonia is not just one thing. Pneumonia is inflammation in the lungs, and lots of different bugs can cause that, but also the environmental factors, the immunity all play a part as well. This last picture is really typical. Noel might be interested in this one. This is really typical of pneumonia in dairy calves. So this sort of cheesy kind of lesions, cheesy pussy kind of lesions is quite typical of Mycoplasma bovis, and Mycoplasma bovis is really pretty prevalent in dairy cattle, beef cattle as well, but in dairy cross calves would probably have a high chance of having this lungs that could look like these. They might not die from it, but if those lungs are affected, that's going to affect growth rates. So can measures be put in place on the farm that you're sourcing from to minimise that risk of what you're buying? So these are the sorts of things that if you get more information, you can suss out where the best place to make interventions would be. So I've put up pictures of many of these pathogens, but when we think about what causes respiratory disease, there's a whole host of viruses, a whole host of bacteria. There's lungworm as a parasite as well. And are all of these pathogens present on all farms? Probably not, okay? So we talked about BVD earlier. We would hope that there are some farms that are, or we know that about 93% of farm breeding herds in Scotland should be clear of BVD. But if they buy in an animal tomorrow that's in calf, that gives birth to a PI calf, then that status is gone straight away. There are herds that are free of IBR. Salmonella is very prevalent in dairy herds, but there will be some dairy herds that have never seen salmonella. There'll be many beef herds that have never seen salmonella. So not all of them are present on all farms, but pathogens, viruses such as RSV, PI3, Pasteurella, they're pretty much going to be present on all farms. But you're not going to see disease on all farms. So what is the difference between infection and disease? And really, to me, it's a balancing act. So it's always a balance between the bugs that are around in the shed and the environment and the animals and the immunity those animals have. And it just depends on which way the balance tips. If you can bolster the immunity really well, then animals should be able to tolerate the bugs, the pathogens that they come across. But if that immunity is not there, then the pathogens will win. So our aim when we're looking at how to prevent respiratory disease is always going to be to minimise the pathogens and to maximise the immunity. So how can we do that? Noel's not going to like this slide because it's saying the opposite probably of his system. But I guess if you're aware that it's not possible in your system, or you're not prepared to avoid buying in, and it's not possible to avoid mixing, that makes it all the more important to make sure that the other aspects are done well. So can you make sure that you're not overstocked? Can you make sure that ventilation is optimal? What can you do to decrease humidity in your sheds? And it's really vital that if you're buying in, if you're mixing groups, that immunity is maximised. So if you're buying young calves in particular, what do you know about the colostrum quality they're getting? Are any checks being put in place to check what the colostrum absorption was like? What vaccinations are being used? Are vaccinations only being given at the time of risk? Or could that be done prior to the time of risk? For those of you on the call who are breeder finishers, you get the perfect opportunity to vaccinate prior to housing, so that vaccine has had full effect before the risk period. What can you do to reduce intercurrent disease? So BVD would be a really key one to make sure that you don't have circulating in your herd. But is there parasitic disease there that you can eliminate to make sure that that's not pulling down the immune system? Lorna did a really good session, and if you didn't catch the session last time, that's available on the YouTube channel. Nutrition is really key, obviously, to getting the nutrition right, but making sure that the trace elements are right as well, just to make sure that immunity is optimal. And what can you do to reduce stressors? It probably is pretty stressful to be a finishing beast, particularly one that's moved holding a few times. But can you make sure that the stressors are not all happening at once? Can you make weaning as stress free as possible, or minimize the stress with that? Can you make sure that you're not castrating and dehorning at the same time, changing diets all at the same time? Can we make sure that they're not getting all of these challenges all at once? Because if they're getting all of these challenges all at once, that's what will tip the balance in favour of the bugs rather than the immunity of the animal. If you do have an outbreak of respiratory disease, then should you go about getting a diagnosis? Discuss it with your vet, but I think there's probably a lot of good reasons why doing some diagnostics would be of benefit. If IBR is involved, you want to know about it, because that's one that a vaccination would be really effective in the face of an outbreak. So if there's an outbreak of respiratory disease, if you don't vaccinate against IBR, you want to know if it's there or not. You want to know if lungworm is involved, because you could throw all the antibiotics at an animal you like. If there's a lungworm burden, then antibiotics are not going to clear that. So I think it's important to understand if lungworm's involved. If animals haven't grazed, then clearly that's not going to be a risk. But if animals have grazed, even if they've had a treatment, it could still be involved. We have been seeing issues with resistance to wormers used for lungworms. So it's one to bear in mind, that just because they've had a dose doesn't eliminate that as being a possible reason. I've talked about why it's important to determine whether BVD is involved or not. If you're using antibiotics, then getting sampling done to understand what bacteria are there and what the sensitivity profile of those bacteria are could be really helpful to determine whether you're using the right antibiotic or not. And if you've got a vaccine protocol in place at the moment, then is that the most effective vaccine protocol? There's vaccines available against all of those bugs that I put up on the table. So are all of them needed, or do you just need some of them? Or is what you need to vaccinate against this year different to what you needed to vaccinate against in the past? If everything else is going well, if they're not experiencing problems with respiratory disease, then vaccinations are probably not necessary. But at least you know that there are tools available to you that, should that situation change, then investigation would be of benefit to determine if a vaccine was appropriate, which one would be most appropriate. And yeah, we all know ourselves from COVID and all the rest of it, that the vaccination ahead of when you are doing your mixing or ahead of the risk period of housing is definitely the way forward. So yeah, I guess I would just urge that if you're looking, if you've got an outbreak of disease, earlier you get your vet involved, the better, because it's really important if samples are going to be taken, that they're taken really early on in the course of disease. So it might be that nasopharyngeal swabs are taken, might be that blood samples are taken, or dung samples if we're looking for lungworm. Hopefully you don't have casualties, but post-mortem examinations can be really good way to get a diagnosis as well. But ideally, we want animals in the acute phase of the disease. So that's animals that are, just at the very first signs of showing disease. So that would be ones with a really high temperature, but they've only got a clear discharge. By the time you start getting a really thick, snotty discharge, the bugs that caused the problem could have come and gone. So you might think, looking at the pen, they're the worst affected, but they might not be the most appropriate ones to sample. But discuss that with your vet, because they'll keep you right on that. But if you only call your vet after you've given them a jag of everything in the cupboard, then the opportunities for diagnostics might have gone. Okay, just a wee plug that if you are experiencing problems, or if you've had problems in the past with bovine respiratory disease, just to be aware that there is funding available for investigation of respiratory disease. So it's through the Preparing for Sustainable Farming programme. Through that programme, there's 9 options you can choose from, one specifically on respiratory disease. And that means that there's funding available to do an investigation, which may or may not involve looking for viruses. But the action that would be required would be for you to implement a sustainable prevention and control plan, including biosecurity measures where relevant, using appropriate expert advice. So that could be getting advice from a consultant or a vet about maybe quarantine procedures, maybe looking at your shed, looking at ventilation. There's lots of different options available to you. And in order to claim that money, it's one form. It's really straightforward. Laura will be able to keep you right about it, but there's £250 per intervention available. You can claim 2 interventions in the year. And if you've not claimed PSF funding in previous years, there's another bonus £250 for supporting learning and development. So attending something like this, even though it's free, that extra £250 could be claimed. So it means that there's £500 available to claim. You need to have done the investigation and action by the end of the calendar year, and the claims need to be submitted by the end of February. But it's a really straightforward form to fill out, a bit for you, a bit for your vet or consultant to fill out as well. And it's a standard payment regardless of the size of your herd. So just bear that in mind that it's money that's up for grabs, and if it's not used, we'll probably lose it. So I'd really encourage people to take up on that funding. Okay, just the last couple of slides before we hand over to Noel. Just going back to our idea of the dynamic health planning, the targets that you set and why you might not reach the target. So if you'd set certain growth rate targets, if animals are being fed optimally, there's no concurrent disease, then could parasites be the challenge that are stopping you from reaching those growth rate targets, for example? So through PSF, there's also options to test for liver fluke and to check if your fluticide treatments are effective, and options to check for if there's a roundworm infection and check for wormer efficacy. So in terms of cattle parasites, Ostertagia is probably the most significant gutworm of cattle, and that affects the abomasum. So this is a picture of the true stomach of cattle, and the Ostertagia worms develop in the glands, the gastric glands, and damage them. And when they damage them, it means that the pH of the abomasum, instead of being really acidic, that rises. And when that rises, that really makes animals feel really inappetent. So part of the biggest reason for weight loss in animals that have got a gutworm burden is their drop in appetite. They will also scour, and their sort of protein metabolism will be damaged, so they'll be losing protein out the back end. But it's the decrease in feed intakes. So if you've got an undiagnosed worm burden in your fattening cattle, that's really going to be holding them back. Again, just because you've treated them doesn't necessarily mean that worm burden has been cleared. So it could be that the wrong dose has been given. It could be that the product used had settled out or was out of date, or there's lots of different reasons for products not working. But increasingly, the more we look for it, we're finding issues with resistance potentially as well. So that's picture of Ostertagia and the abomasum. Liver fluke is obviously a really significant burden as well. I suppose a lot of people might be tempted to use combination products in the thought of, let's clear animals out of any parasitic burden and make sure that job's done. But I guess I would just urge you to use your health planning sessions as an opportunity to figure out with your vet or SQP if you're buying anthelmintics from merchants, what parasites are you actually trying to target? If, for those of you who are the breeding finishers, if you know that your calves have not been on boggy land, perhaps you could test to see if they had a fluke burden, because if they've not got a fluke burden, using a combination product that treats for fluke as well is not necessary. So it's a huge topic this. We could spend a whole day talking about parasites, but I just want you to sort of bear that in mind. Don't treat it as just a combination product will just clear them out and that'll be that. There are problems with resistance, potentially problems with resistance. If you've got that, you need to know about it. And it might be that more narrow spectrum products are more suitable than broad spectrum ones. Your vets can keep you right, but there's really good guidance on what active ingredients are in different products. And yeah, be sure that if you are using products like wormers, make sure you use as little as possible, but as much as necessary, and make sure they're used right. So weighing animals, making sure your dosing guns are calibrated, giving them by the correct route. Unfortunately, we have had instances where like a pour-on product was given orally. Horrendous, but these mistakes do happen. So yeah, just wanted to just check with your vets or SQPs that you're doing the right thing. Okay, last slide from me. Last gory pictures from me. I guess if your targets were to reduce mortality on your unit, most units will have a sudden death now and again, won't they? And one of the most common causes of sudden death is Clostridial disease. I guess I just wanted to get across that Clostridial disease is not just, well, number one, it's not just a sheep issue. Many folk who've got sheep will vaccinate against Clostridial disease, but the number of cattle keepers vaccinating against Clostridial disease will be much less, but the risks are the same. Clostridial disease isn't just an outside problem. We can get cases of Clostridial disease inside as well. So I've got a couple of pictures here just of this. These are images of blackleg, so that's caused by Clostridium shovii, and that causes, it's an anaerobic bacteria that releases toxins, and the toxins causes sudden death. But what might be seen is that say if there was blackleg in a muscle, like a back leg, for example, that leg might appear swollen. When that's skinned, the muscle itself would be very, very dark, and there would be kind of gas bubbles in it. Through our post-mortem wounds, blackleg isn't actually the most common diagnosed Clostridial disease that we see, probably because a lot of diagnoses of that are made on farm as a presumptive diagnosis. We actually see a lot more Black's disease. So this picture here is from the surface of a liver. This pale lesion is only a few centimetres, in diameter really. But this bacteria that causes this Clostridium novii really thrives if there's areas of the liver that are damaged. So a common way that a liver would be damaged would be from migrating liver fluke, or say if there had been an episode of acidosis, even if it was a sort of subacute ruminal acidosis, that could cause seeding of bacteria to the liver, cause liver damage, and that could allow conditions for Clostridium novii to proliferate. And again, those toxins can cause a sudden death. So Clostridial vaccines are cheap and effective, and probably a really good insurance policy. The other one we see is people think of it a lot more in lambs than they do in cattle, but pulpy kidney, so Clostridium perfringens, enterotoxemia. Animals are probably particularly susceptible if there's changes in diet, and so perfringens can overgrow and toxins released, and that can cause a sudden death. So Clostridial disease, if you're not vaccinating against Clostridial disease, it'd be well worth discussing that with your vet if that's something that you should be considering, because it's an insurance policy, because it's Clostridial bacteria are everywhere, and all livestock are at risk of them. Okie doke. I hope that'll do, Laura. I've probably overrun my time a little bit, but I hope that gives you a bit of an idea of the sorts of risks that I see, the disaster stories that I see with finishing herds. But by getting more information about what's going on in your own herds, hopefully you can put in measures in place to prevent these being a problem in your place.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks, Helen. It was very interesting. Just going to give a quick overview of what we are doing at home, and then probably tell you more about how we are combating mainly pneumonias. Really is what we find in our finishing business. It can give us problems, especially at this time of year. So I'm Noel Gall. I'm at home farm Kininmonth with my mum and dad, my wife Jo, and it's just beside Peterhead, Aberdeenshire. So you can thank. We hosted BeefTech in the spring, and we can thank them for the first three slides, so I didn't have to do any work for this, which I'm very happy about. We're growing like 600 acre of crop, which is mainly to be fed, so we're feeding a high energy diet to finishing cattle, is mainly what we're doing. So I want to grow as much crop as I can to feed and bed. We'll sell bits and pieces of oilseed rape and oats. Grasses for grazing and silage for calves, and this to also put into our starter ration, what we call our starter ration. So we'll cover that later a wee bit, but it's cattle that we're wanting to finish, but we can't obviously put them straight into barley. And then we've started growing with a more faster growing ryegrass and aiming for a 4-cut system to produce a wee bit of better silage for feeding the calves as well. I am also a breeder finisher, so we're running 90 cows, mainly what I find grazing cows on bits of rougher land that I think is better than trying to graze a store to finish. So that's kind of where our cow job keeps coming from. We're finishing nearly 1,000 cattle a year, and that's every week of the year sort of thing. We want to put cattle away, and we don't buy cattle every week of the year, but we'll buy cattle every month, no problem. And then what else have we got in there? We are then one full-time employee. So when Helen's speaking about our team, that's one of our team, for vaccination program and stuff. He's knows all what we need to be doing and realizes that everything has to be done correctly and we don't miss anything, which I'll come to later on as well. But then also our vet, and our vet's been very, our team-wise, vet's been very influential in what we're doing, and nutrition, because obviously the nutrition of these cattle that we are trying to finish needs to be right from the start, so we don't end up with them going backwards for whatever reason. Also, we're doing some contracting in the biomass, and we run my wife runs a hotel 5 miles up the road. Laura, you can just click on. Quite speedy. So cows, I was thinking about what Helen was saying about cows, and there's a lot of, obviously the poll shows a lot of breeder finishers. So we've got 90 Solera cross cows. They're all we don't want to produce our own heifer to bull. I find that we just concentrate on one thing. So but 10 years ago I started buying heifers from one guy. So continually, it's the only thing we buy from one source. So he's a BVD-free herd, and we tag test all our calves every year, every single one, because we have had a BVD problem years past, and so now we're just tag testing everything. If I've got a problem, I know about it way before they're a year old, or when you're doing dung samples of 5. You might miss them. So I just find they're a wee bit more expensive to buy those tags, but you just know for a fact what you've got and what you don't have, and especially in our situation with feeding cattle coming in, possibly stuff touching over fences. On the cow job, I'm wanting a easy calving cow that will rear a calf to finish at 18 months. So same goes for the calves as it goes for they're not all going to finish at 18 months, obviously, but same goes for the calves, it goes for the finishing cattle. I want them to be healthy from the word go. We're pushing them fairly hard, especially in the last 6 months. So ration, nutrition, and health is what's going to keep them going. Try to keep it simple. The cow thing, we're wanting to buy the cows for one guy, so they're all quite similar. We want to try and calve them in 2 months. 2 months. It's never really done. It's more like 12 weeks, probably in reality. You let them some slip or whatever, but we want to calve them. We want to calve them quickly. We've got enough other stuff to do, and that cow, generally fends for ourselves. They're pretty good that way. But we try to keep the calves away from our finishing herd at the end. Like when we up that point, keep them away for the problems in pneumonia, really, especially at a young age. We'll go to slide 3, Laura. I presume you can hear me okay. Yeah. Slide 3. So this is what I would call the main part of our business. Probably, I think Kirsty called it the engine room, where everything seems to rotate around our finishing herd, our finishing cattle. We're growing feed to feed to these cattle, and we're making sure we've got the straw. We need to buy in a little bit of straw and buy in some feed, and it's all going back in the land. So this is what we're doing, but this is where we find all our health problems. All the cattle are sourced from Andy Ingram, so I was having a wee bit of a look, or not all of them, but the majority. I was having a wee bit of a look, when we're speaking about cattle getting mixed and all the problems you have. So we're buying from the length and breadth of Scotland. They're Orkney to Ayr, Hexham, Carlisle in England, and then I was looking. There might be an even so if we get cattle home, it could be from 5 or 6 different sellers just in one market that day. So we've got a lot of mixing and a lot of disease pressure coming to our farm just even in one day. So at the bottom, we're saying our strict vaccination policy, which I'll speak about a wee bit later on. Yeah, so I'm quite speedy. Quite speedy. So we could go to slide 4. So this is really what we're trying to do as a practical kind of thing. So we're very aware that our system is extremely high risk in terms of disease pressure, what Helen was speaking about. So we try to do things to mitigate that problem. So you can see some of the sheds there just to kind of give you an idea of this. But when we have one of those pens and any of the sheds empty, I'll probably speak to Andy or whoever and say I'm wanting some cattle, and it could be anywhere between 30 and 60, maybe even a bit more in some pens. And we try to fill that pen as quickly as possible. The quicker we can fill it, the quicker we can get them vaccinated, treated, and then settled down, and that's them in that pen. So as I've said here, all cattle will stay in their groups once they're home for a minimum of 100 days. So what I mean by that is we'll fill the pen up and then they go in there and then that's them. We don't want to be picking out the odd one because we think it looks a bit fatter or thinner or something. They stay in that pen and that's them for 100 days minimum, probably more like 120. We'll pick fat cattle out of there and then we will we'll probably go back again and then say we pick another pen, then the two, once they can both of them fit into one pen, they'll be mixed, and that's the only time they'll be mixed. So we'll mix them once and they'll have that little bit of stress. By that time they've been with us probably 4 months. We'll mix them once and then that pen will be emptied till they're all away. We won't let them go mix with something else. The chances are that by that time they haven't thriven quick enough, they haven't they maybe got a problem, so we're not needing them going and mixing with everybody else again. So that's how we kind of get to the finish. So once we once we get them home, we'll get up to numbers. They all go through the race. They'll get vaccinated, weighed. We'll tag them for if the stuff I need to know is different when they're going away, either if they're an Angus or non-assured or potentially going to be OTM by the time they leave. A few little things like that. So, and then after that, they go into pens like what you can see, and we do what we call our starter ration. So our starter ration is nothing fancy, but we just, at minimum, it's halved. So our full strength diet gets then halved, and we half it with silage, and that's just. And at that time, we also make sure they've got like extra straw lying around. They're well bedded. But all our sheds don't look like these ones in the photos, but we want them to be well ventilated, so they can, so any diseases are going to blow away. Hopefully, when we go back to our homebred calves this time of year, we've weaned all our calves and we house them away. The thought of having those calves around 500 feeding cattle, I don't know how long you keep them going for. So we keep it just because the way it works for grazing, but they stay away at a different farm and they'll stay there till they are they'll be over a year old, and then they'll come home and they'll go on to probably what we'd call our finishing system. However, even though they're 5 miles away, they get the same vaccination program as what we do with everything else. And then we know, so here's our vaccinations, perfectly timed. So, but everything gets the same. So this is what we're doing. I think there is other things that we could be doing, but I feel like we're given, well, it's Boveless IBR up the nose, intranasals up the nose. So we're then injecting Hippobovelus under the skin and Animex Super under the skin. And that's 4 different things. I know, Helen, you can jump in if you want, but I kind of feel like we're giving them enough. We could go with the mycoplasmas, we could go with the black leg, but I've just, at the moment, we're doing these 4. And it's working for us. So if I just go down them, we're doing it's Boveless IBR, and I just can't see the reason not to do it. If you were to do one and only one, it would be IBR. I've seen the damage. We had a number of years ago a problem with it, and it's just, yeah, it just goes through them all. And it's so cheap to do, £2.60 a head to do. I don't really grudge it. Intranasal, the next one, does seem quite expensive, but we used to do intranasal only in maybe these months at the moment, so maybe October, November, December, what people call the high pressure months. And it came to a point I was like, oh, who knows when the high pressure months are? Who knows what these cattle are that we're buying? We're buying them for up and down the length of the country. Who knows? So I just decided that we just go with it. We just do it all the time. Because the time that you don't decide not to do it is the time you'll have a problem and you'll be kicking yourself for the sake of £7 a head. We don't do the cars background. Hippobovelus. I was just looking up a bit and spoke to Ewan about it, but our vet, and I didn't know exactly what it is, but it's BRD, I think. Helen, is that correct? It's covers BRD.
So BRD just means bovine respiratory disease. So that I think it's against Histophilus, which is
I couldn't really work it out, but it says it's extremely useful for animals under stress, including transport and mixing. So I thought we covered all of those.
Yeah. It's Histophilus somni, and we probably particularly see issues with Histophilus somni in fattening units when animals are being pushed hard. So it can cause it can cause a normal kind of pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, but it can also cause damage to the muscle of the heart. It can also cause damage to the muscle of the throat, and it can cause brain problems as well. So they sometimes talk about sleeper calves, or it can cause some death. So it can be a pathogen on its own, or in conjunction with the other viruses and things that you're covering for as well.
Yeah. Well, I want to cover them all. And that one, I think me and Ewan discussed it. Our vet, and we kind of said we just decided it would get done as well. And so we kind of implemented this, and it's not super fancy, but seems to be doing the job for us. It's it's doing. We had problems in the past, and we were jumping in and out of doing things, and we say, oh, we can do that now and do that now, and now we just went down that. As I said at the bottom, it's my insurance policy. It's not even a percent of the cost of the animal. I know there's a lot of breeder finishers on here, but for me, this is just it does it. So, and then obviously we antibiotic use, we're not going to use it. If we have a problem, I've seen it in the past. We're using this taloxane quite often. It seems to be quite good for the job. It's not very cheap, but it lasts a long time, so you don't have to go get them out again. If you've got one animal with pneumonia or clinical signs of pneumonia, so you're picking out that one, there's 10 or 30, you picked out one, you've jabbed him with 21 quid of taloxane, the likelihood is he's done some damage to his lungs. He's probably lost condition, lost weight, so he hasn't grown for the previous 7 days. He's probably not going to grow for the next 21, I would guess. And feed costs alone, I think we're running about our feed cost is £2 a day a head or thereabouts. Feed costs alone, before any other costs, you're 60 quid. You're 80 quid a beast. Just, and I'm not saying we don't get problems, but that's the next thing I was going to say, that we know what we don't have. When we do have an outbreak of something, we get the vet out. This is up and down the list of IBR, intranasal, Hippobovis, this is the things we don't have. We shouldn't, Animex super covers lungworm. We shouldn't have lungworm. And we know, and that does fluke as well, you know, all the things that we shouldn't have, and it becomes easier to treat at that stage. I think that's what we're doing. I don't know if that's, hope that's what you're looking for, Laura, but that's what we're doing. And I think, oh yeah, I was going to say, so every animal, we do every animal, we've got no exceptions. So about 2 years ago, we bought a single bull, and I never even thought about it. And he came home about a month before he was meant to go outside, and he was in the shed for 2 days, just where we take home all our cattle. He went outside the grass, and he was dead within another week with IBR. We had him tested, and he had IBR. And then I spoke to the breeder, and he says, "Oh, but we dose him for IBR." From then on, nothing gets past the gate without the full works. So in the summertime, I bought another bull, and I had no other fattening cattle come home. So unfortunately, I had to crack open a 5 dose of IBR, a 5 dose of intranasal, and whatever else, everything else it was. And I'm not sure what it cost, but it didn't. In a way, it didn't really matter because you're keeping these bulls to stay for a long time. And Kirsty did her stuff for the beef tech. So she was telling me last night that our mortality was 0% in 2024. So in 2024, we bought 998 cattle and we sold 995. But I do what those three died of, but I would imagine there was at least one in there with blackleg, and I'm not sure what the other two were. But that's what, so you know, it's working for us as far as mortality is, and that's what it's about, keeping them alive. And if we're keeping that many alive, we're hopefully keeping the rest of them pretty healthy.
So I think it's been quite clear that it's quite important to get a diagnosis. And the bonus is that up until the end of this year, we have got PSF funding available to help fund that. And then using that diagnosis to understand what challenges we face on our farms so that we can balance the pathogens and immunity, whether that is changing the environment, using vaccinations. There's a whole host of tools that we've got available in our toolkit to ensure good health. But it should be speak to your farm vet and your health team, whether that's your SQPs or just your general staff that's on farm administering these medicines and checking out the animal's health. And so the last webinar in this series is on the 2nd of December on marketing. So it would be great to see you there. You can sign up on the Farm Advisory Service website if you haven't already done so.